The Casablanca Conference, Part 1 and 2. Narrated by Sasha Maggio. It was not unusual for President Roosevelt's travel plans to be kept secret, especially during the war. So it was not seen as unusual when he took a special train north on 9 January 1943. Many just assumed he was heading home to Hyde Park in New York. He was not. He took the train to Baltimore, then changed direction and went to Miami. From there, he got on a Boeing 314 named the Dixie Clipper and traveled for about 10 hours before landing in Trinidad. The next day, they traveled for another 9 hours to Brazil to refuel. From Brazil, they traveled 19 hours, crossing 2,100 miles of the Atlantic until they reached the British-controlled Gambia on 13 January. This was the first time that a U.S. president had traveled by air on official business, the first time a U.S. president had left the country during a war, and the first time a U.S. president visited Africa, and the trip wasn't over yet. From Gambia, FDR and his party changed to C-54 planes and traveled the final 1,600-mile leg of their journey to Morocco, at times having to fly as low as 1,000 feet. They finally landed in Casablanca around 5 p.m. on 14 January 1943. Casablanca was well within the range of German bombers, so secrecy was a top priority. Lieutenant Colonel Elliott Roosevelt met his father when he arrived, but even then he had not been told why he was going to Morocco. The presidential party made its way to the Anfa Hotel, where the conference would take place. The guest book reveals the names of some of the attendees: Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, General George Patton, FDR's closest advisor, Harry Hopkins, and many others. That evening, the British and American leaders had dinner, and FDR and Churchill stayed up until 3 a.m., discussing strategy, drinking, and smoking like long-lost friends. The villa FDR was staying in was called Dar es Sara, which Churchill translated as abode of divine favor. These are pictures from FDR's suite. The Casablanca Conference will last for about 10 days, beginning on 15 January 1943, and this important series of meetings will help determine the way forward for the Allies in planning to win the war. I did not include Eastern Front topics in last year's series, mostly because I don't have the bandwidth to cover them well by myself, but I will note here that Stalin was invited to this conference and declined on account of the battles his army was engaged in. The Free French had representation at the conference, with both Charles de Gaulle and Henri Guiraud present. Adding to the complexity was the role of the French, who had initially fought the Americans when they came ashore in Morocco. And things were no doubt a little awkward because the French generals were not included in the discussion and planning sessions. There were two French factions, one led by General Henri Guiraud and one led by General Charles de Gaulle. One British general noted that they hated each other more than they hated the Germans. Guiraud was seen as more agreeable from the American perspective, while de Gaulle was considered more agreeable with the British. But both French generals made an effort for this event. Although it has been noted that FDR more or less forced Guiraud and de Gaulle to shake hands for a photo op, and the French generals executed the handshake so quickly, they had to be asked to repeat it for a second shot. The meetings went on for 10 days, and tempers flared on more than one occasion. The topic of an invasion of the European continent by crossing the English Channel into France once again came up and was once again challenged. FDR and Churchill and their senior military leaders had gone back and forth for over a year regarding an invasion of France, not so much whether it would happen, but when, where, and how. The British had convinced the Americans to focus on North Africa first, and that's what we did, launching Operation Torch in November 1942, 11 months after the U.S. joined the Allies in the war. The Casablanca Conference was not the only focus for FDR. This was the first time since the Civil War that an American president had been in a battle zone, and FDR was determined to review the troops despite the objections of the Secret Service. The Battle of Morocco had ended just 2 months earlier, and hundreds of thousands of American troops were now coming ashore and heading into battle in Tunisia. But none of them knew their commander-in-chief was in their midst. FDR reviewed the 30th Infantry Battalion near Casablanca on 18 January, and on 21 January he traveled up the coast to Rabat, where some of the fiercest fighting had taken place, and there he reviewed the 3rd Infantry Division. The GIs were shocked and thrilled to see FDR as he saluted from his jeep. The president visited the new military cemetery at Mahdia and had lunch with Harry Hopkins, General Patton, and his troops. FDR ate standard Army rations from a mess kit, boiled ham, sweet potatoes, string beans, and coffee. The Army band played his favorite songs, including Chattanooga Choo Choo and Deep in the Heart of Texas. Roosevelt was deeply moved by the experience, and when he returned home, he wrote dozens of personal letters to the families of servicemen he met and to the families of soldiers buried at Mahdia. This conference involved both FDR and Churchill, as well as their most trusted senior staff and senior military leaders. During the meetings, they established the way forward for the Allies in this war, mapping out the grand strategy for both the European and the Pacific theaters. The Casablanca Conference was not the first of this type of conference during World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, a conference was held from December 1941 until January 1942 in Washington, D.C. Now we are at Casablanca a little over a year later, and this year there will be a few more in 1943. Quebec, Cairo, and Tehran. Among the major issues discussed in depth during the Casablanca Conference was the proposal repeatedly made by Stalin for the Allies to establish a second front. Stalin had hoped a second front in the West would distract Hitler and ease the pressure in the East. General Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, wanted to land troops in France as soon as possible, but the combined Chiefs of Staff decided instead to invade Sicily and then the Italian mainland in order to drive Italy out of the war. Other topics for deliberation included material assistance to Russia and China and the campaign against the Japanese in the Solomon Islands. The military leaders and planners established common definitions, like having a set use of unified command and supreme commander, as well as what is meant by combined and joint forces. The term joint refers to the participation of forces from two or more of the arms, if American, or services, if British, of one nation. And the term combined refers to the participation of forces of two or more of the United Nations. And just a reminder that this is not the UN that we know today, but the United Nations that signed an agreement to fight the Axis in World War II. Establishing common definitions and mutual understanding of the command structure was an absolute necessity. Remember, at this time, the concepts of combined arms, joint operations, multinational or coalition partnerships, etc., were still new and developing. We also defined a Supreme Commander role. General Pershing had been a Supreme Commander of American forces in France in the First World War. But this was a different type of war and an evolving concept that will eventually include formal command of Allied forces. In cases where the governments concerned so decide, a Supreme Commander will be appointed for operations when forces of more than one of the United Nations are to be employed on a specific mission or task. He will be appointed by agreement between the governments concerned at the earliest possible moment after the decision to undertake an operation has been made. He will exercise unified command over all forces of the United Nations allocated to his operation. He will be the recipient of all major directives pertaining to the arms and services of his force. Out of the means allocated to him, he will organize task forces as necessary, designate their commanders, and assign the major tasks to be performed by each. There were notes in the results of the Casablanca Conference on not separating forces of one nation unless the circumstances absolutely require it, and other guidance for maintaining unit cohesion under a supreme commander. The combined planners at the Casablanca Conference reiterated that the ultimate goal of any basic strategy they compile must remain to bring the war to a successful conclusion at the earliest possible date. And in gaining this objective, efforts must be made toward the destruction of the economic and military power of all our adversaries at a rate exceeding their power of replacement, with Nazi Germany remaining, quote, the primary and most powerful and pressing enemy. FDR will note after the conference that this was not meant to be the destruction of the population of Germany, Italy, or Japan, but it did mean the destruction of the philosophies in those countries which are based on conquest and the subjugation of other people. Although the Americans still wanted to get in the fight against the Axis forces on the European continent as soon as possible, and still wanted to prioritize an attack launched across the English Channel into Nazi-occupied France, the ultimate decision was set on Italy. Several options were presented regarding the availability of forces and equipment, and possible timelines for the U.S. Army and the British Army to launch a combined assault on Sicily, followed by an invasion of mainland Italy. Among the possible options, it looked like late August would be the earliest this could happen. There were limiting factors, such as transporting troops from the UK to Egypt and the Middle East for training and preparing to invade Sicily. There was also a need for a large number of Navy vessels and landing craft. Training obviously had to take place in advance of the operation. It would be difficult to pull frontline units from fighting the Axis in North Africa so that we could task them with the Sicily operation. And we did not yet have a complete plan, but we will. The conference provided an initial planning opportunity for Operation Husky, which will take place in July and August of 1943, so we will cover it this year. On 22 January 1943, nearing the end of the Casablanca Conference, the Sultan of Morocco hosted a dinner for the American and British leaders. It was an opulent affair with the traditional exchange of state gifts, in this case a jewel-encrusted tiara and a magnificent ceremonial sword. At the conclusion of the Casablanca Conference on 24 January 1943, about 40 war correspondents from the US and UK were flown to Morocco from Algiers and Tunisia for a press conference with FDR and Churchill. They were not told why they were going and were stunned to find out that the President, the Prime Minister, and their combined chiefs of staff and military leaders had been in North Africa for more than a week. FDR demonstrated once again his genius in using the media to tell the story he wanted told. It was a beautiful day, the Moroccan skies a deep clear blue as the North African sun blazed brightly overhead. Security was extremely tight. The area was surrounded with barbed wire and armed guards every 20 feet. Fighter planes circled overhead. Roosevelt and Churchill invited the reporters to sit on the grass, and then they read their statements and took questions. One of the first things that FDR said was that Premier Stalin had been invited to join them, but he could not come because of the battles raging in Russia. He will show up to one of the later conferences this year. This press conference, held on the lawn by the Anfa Hotel in Casablanca on 24 January 1943, is when FDR would first publicly use the phrase "unconditional surrender," in reference to the Axis nations participating in World War II. Churchill reiterated the sentiment presented by FDR and noted that the 10-day conference was the most important and successful war conference which I have ever attended or witnessed. Afterward, Churchill made one more request of the American president before they left Morocco. He asked for FDR to accompany him to Marrakesh, which he described as simply the nicest place on earth to spend an afternoon. At 1:30 p.m. on the 24th, a well-armed caravan left Casablanca and headed south for the walled city of Marrakesh. FDR and Churchill drove past camel caravans, olive and orange groves, and arrived at a villa being used by the American vice consul. Churchill told the villa's servants to form a chair with their arms and carry President Roosevelt up to the top of the villa's small tower. The two great leaders watched the peaks of the Atlas Mountains turn pink as the sun set over the Moroccan desert. The next day, FDR set out for the long trip home to D.C. On the final leg from Trinidad to Miami, the president celebrated his 61st birthday with a cake shared on the plane with his senior advisors. The Casablanca Conference was a smashing success, and it inspired the world with its boldness and audacity. There were still many months of bitter fighting ahead, but in every way the tide was turning in the Allies' favor. Thank you for joining me today. The references included in the 2 Twitter threads presented here are linked below in the description. If you are a fan of this content, please consider subscribing to my accounts on any or all platforms, as that helps me know that the content is worth the effort. And stick around. This might be the best series yet.